Our next presenters are Dr. Prash Puspanathan and Agnieszka Sekula. Prash is a medical doctor and a former neuropsychiatry fellow at the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne. He's one of Australia's leading advocates for accessible psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and in this capacity he is a clinical advisor to the Australian Psychedelic Society and is actually involved in a couple of the clinical trials that are just starting up in Australia now. Agnieszka Sekula is a scientist with a background in biomedical engineering and medical imaging. Agnieszka is devoted to science outreach, extensively advocating for open science efforts. She won the Best Speaker Award at 3D MED Australia and the MyLabs Image of the Year Award. Her work has been displayed worldwide, including Shanghai Expo, Florence Biennale, and the Sounds of Space exhibition in Austria and South Africa. As a freelance journalist, Agnieszka has produced numerous articles on altered states of consciousness, including Transcendental Therapy, Mysticism, Psychedelics, and Mental Health article for the prestigious Sekula magazine. Hope I got that right. So I'd like to welcome Prash and Agnieszka onto the stage. Their talk will be New World Technology and Old World Wisdom. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Prash, that's Agnieszka, just in case there was any confusion. We work on the intersection of technology, the largely unexplored intersection of technology and psychedelic therapy. And we recognize that it's a potentially contentious topic, particularly when not understood. And we hope that by explaining our approach and our ideology and our thought process, we can make everyone recognize that this isn't a nifty gimmick. It isn't a play on the metaverse, God forbid. And that there's a lot of thought and process that has gone into developing this. And hopefully we can convince you that technology can be a friend and not just a foe. I'm going to be giving mostly context, and then I'll let Agnieszka dive into the actual juicy bits. And as context goes, I'd like to start by talking about, as Robin Carhart-Harris titled his 2018 paper, the essential importance of context. And context is an all-encompassing term that includes, but isn't limited to set and setting, which is a term I think most of us recognize, but really encompasses far more than that. And in a lot of ways encompasses all the non-pharmacological elements that are involved in psychedelic therapy. Psychedelic therapy is a process. There's the medicine, which is obviously critical, or we wouldn't have the name or the whole idea. But there are so many other elements to the process. And unfortunately, innovation in the space currently is very much focused on the medicine. On the global scale, this is to the tune of about $1.7 billion in the last year, has been focused on the medicine. But there are all the other elements to the process. There's the therapy, obviously, and that has been explored, but obviously there hasn't been as much money going into exploring this. And then there are all the other non-pharmacological factors, the setting, the context, things like the music. And really at the moment, there's only one real outfit, Mendel Kaelen and his team at Wave Parts, who have been exploring music as a contextual element, but very little has gone into this. So just diving a bit deeper into set and setting. Again, I think this is a crowd where I don't have to delve into this in too much detail. But if I was going to, set is something that we can separate out if we want to, and this is non-exhaustive, but just as an example, things like your one's physical health. Are you well? Are you unwell at the time? What's your acute psychological state? Do you have pressures riding upon you? External pressures, internal pressures, acute psychological distress? What's your prior knowledge of the experience? What kind of priors are you taking into the experience? These are the factors that encompass what we often call set. And then you have setting, which really should be considered with far more nuance than we often do. And this is something that I like to call the contextual onion, based on the different layers. And So you have the individual at the center, and then you have, I've tabled it, sentient energies. So the people in the room with them, for example, who exert a very direct impact on the individual going through the experience. Then there's the environmental setting. Are you hot? Are you cold? Is the room appropriately designed such that it is conducive to the experience? Often that is about as far as we often think about when we think of set and setting. But there is so much more to it. The socio-political milieu in which the whole session is occurring. What is the historical and psychosocial landscape? Are drugs illegal? Are drugs legal in this particular place? What is the general cultural attitudes towards psychedelics? These are the factors that we often don't consider, but exert a far more insidious effect on the experience. And these are the contextual elements that I'd like for us to consider. Just a very brief demonstration of, and I've called this the shamanic onion. In traditional settings, as we often like to think of them, the socio-political milieu and the historical context is of a particular form. The environmental setting can be of a particular form. The sentient energies or gravities within the room can be of a particular form, and the individual going through the experience can be of a particular form. And I apologize if I've used cliched images, but Google Images offers me a limited range. But there's congruence and coherence throughout all of these factors. However, now, as psychedelic therapy and the use of psychedelics, at least in the mainstream context that we're talking about now, has shifted from that mold and that model through to what sits on your right now, which is psychedelic therapy fitted into a much more clinical setting. That coherence has been largely lost. And as a result of that coherence being lost, the coherence has been lost, and yet we still are attempting to try and sort of fit it into that mainstream model, clinical model that we have, while still drawing on very old school wisdom. And that coherence is something that we would like to counter. Agnieszka and I wrote an article about we see psychedelic therapy as a challenge to the status quo of mental health treatment, but we would like to challenge the status quo of that challenge to the status quo. We'd like to challenge the way psychedelic therapy is being sort of largely accepted as this is the way we always do things. And we recognize that the context, the setting in which we conduct this therapy may not be ideal, and it has largely been unchanged over years. This is just some examples from descriptions of methodology in various different trials which are being conducted, and it hasn't really changed much across different trials. And which led us to ask the question, if this is how psychedelic therapy exists today, largely in preparation, dosing, and integration, and if we feel that there is a lack of coherence across the different phases of therapy, if we feel that each therapeutic phase exists in a relative silo, and there is very little connection between that, what can we do to try and increase that coherence? How can we think about therapeutic models differently to try and achieve that coherence? And is there a way that technology can be useful in improving that coherence? Because technology has always been really useful in improving the human elements in any system. Right? Humans are flawed, we are limited, we are, after all, made of flesh and bone, and technology has always been excellent at helping us scale that and improve that. And that is very much what we are working on, and I'll let Agnieszka describe the rest. Thank you.
So I will dive into a little bit more detail in terms of what can we do to actually redesign psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy to be a little bit more fitting with the model that we understand today. And in doing so, I will look at specific problems that we've identified in our research, and then look at what kind of design principles we can follow in guiding that redesign process. So firstly, we do recognize that there's an over-reliance on talk therapy in current psychotherapeutic approach. We obviously all know how a psychedelic experience feels like, how emotional and embodied that experience is, and being expected to then go to a therapist and be able to put that into words is something that we all struggle with. One of the key characteristics of a psychedelic experience is that it's ineffable, so by definition it is very difficult to put that into words. So then being expected to go to a therapist's office and give an elaborate account of that experience and try to discuss it in words seems almost bizarre. And that might lead to that difficulty that we find in terms of retaining the information, retaining what that experience actually felt like in order to properly process it, because we're expected to explain it in words. And the way we see it being addressed is by moving the talk therapy model into more experience-based therapy model. So basically promoting more experiential moments in therapy and using more experience-based approaches in psychedelic treatment than the talk therapy methods. Secondly, we do unfortunately encounter what we know as the patient-therapist hierarchy. It's inevitable in the sense of the patient being the visitor in a therapist office, they're the guest in the clinic or the therapist space, and in doing so, they are the ones who are being led on that therapy process rather than the ones who are leading that process. And that might be something that we see aiding that sense of anxiety and inability to surrender into the experience, because there is no sense of empowerment that we get from being those visitors in the therapist space. So what we would like to see more of in psychedelic-based treatments is that increase of sense of empowerment and prioritizing the empowerment of the patient so that they know that they're once in the driving seat of their healing journey. And lastly, what we see is that unfortunate siloed nature of psychedelic treatment. The way it's structured at the moment very often is within a few sessions, 6 to 10 sessions of integration process. And this is something that is very detached from the day-to-day experiences of the patients. And there's very little that they can do in order to maintain the benefits of those sessions and take it with them into the rest of their lives. So what we would like to see is ensuring that there is that sense of permanence of treatment right at the beginning of therapy, so that the patients go into therapy knowing that there's going to be some sort of permanent framework set out for them so they can continue the therapy for as long as they need that. And as Prash mentioned, the way we are approaching it very broadly is through experience design of therapy. And more specifically, we're using technology to be able to allow us a little bit more freedom and exploration in that experience design. Specifically, one of the tools that we're using is the immersive tech. And I will speak about why virtual reality might be uniquely suited to meet all those guiding principles that I just outlined. Firstly, we think about promoting the experiential moments in therapy. If you consider what the preparation phase of the psychedelic treatment is planned for, is that sense of preparing for what an altered state of consciousness experience feels like. There is the need to prepare the patient of what to expect in terms of both positive and negative, what kind of challenges to expect, and also that there might be certain disappointment with the experience itself. And that is supposed to prepare patients to be able to surrender to the experience and be a little bit more brave in exploring those experiences that are more challenging. But again, talking about an altered state experience does not do it justice. It's very difficult to prepare someone for what an altered state experience, what an altered state of consciousness experience feels like by just talking about it. However, we can prepare patients for that by actually inducing an altered state in the preparation phase with methods other than psychedelic substances. That is often used through meditation. And so what we do see is that patients who practice meditation are more capable of going deeper into a psychedelic experience than those who don't. So there's something about that practice of entering an altered state that makes it easier to then enter it when it's expected during the dosing session. This is something that is exploited not just in therapy, it's exploited also by high-performing teams. For example, the American Navy, who are practicing entering an altered state of consciousness in their daily training through meditation, through sensory deprivation, through gravity swings, so that they have a better familiarity with what an altered state of consciousness feels like, and they can induce that at will during their missions and enter that state of flow that is so necessary for them to merge as a group. What we see is that virtual reality is capable of eliciting altered state of consciousness. There's more research being done into this at the moment. David Glavatsky has done a very interesting study on his isness model that is showing that by using VR, we can induce an alteration of consciousness that is somewhat similar to that can be used with other methods. But what is important is that it's very reliable and it's very easy for patients to do that, even if they have no experience with using other methods. Secondly, during the dosing session, one of the critical things that we look at in therapy is to be able to have patients establishing a mindful presence. And what that means is basically staying with the feeling, whatever that feeling is, being introspective about the feelings that you're experiencing, and focusing on the experience at hand without trying to distract yourself with other thoughts or emotions. Mindfulness or state of mindfulness can be very successful in inducing a deeper state of psychedelic experience. It leads to more complete mystical experiences in patients who have experience with mindfulness. And so what we would like to do is to have, again, a reliable method of inducing a mindful presence that can be used in this acute setting at the beginning of a dosing session. It is much easier to induce a state of mindfulness in sort of our daily experiences when we have the time, when we're more relaxed, but it's much more difficult to do that when we are stressed, when we are right before taking a strong substance, and we might be acutely anxious about the process that is about to happen. VR, again, is very good at reliably inducing that mindful presence, especially in acutely stressful scenarios. And that is why it is often used in hospital settings, especially among children who are much more difficult to calm down, whether it's before, for example, changing the wound dressing. So that's something that is distracting them and inducing that kind of immediate stress relief, but also that mindful presence that is separate to what the current experience is like. And lastly, in relation to experience, what we do see, which is sort of interesting area that hasn't been really explored yet fully, is that combining different state-altering practices at the same time can lead to a much more profound psychedelic experience. So again, this is something that has been explored with meditation and the use of psychedelics, but also back in the 70s with the use of LSD and sensory deprivation, for example, to induce a more complete mystical experience. And that's something that is explored in traditional settings all the time. Most of the psychedelic substances are being taken in settings that, for example, induce trance for either the use of music or dancing. What we see is that virtual reality, as I said, has the capacity of inducing an altered state, and it also shares some of the mechanisms with the psychedelic experience that might be interesting for us to explore. There's that loss of sense of space and time and the relationship to one's body. There is that ineffable nature of the experience that we spoke about. And there's also the state of awe, which is quite interesting. Awe can be induced with a variety of different methods, but most of the time it's a very sudden, quick, and shallow type of awe. Psychedelics induce a very strong, destabilizing, something that we call a slow simmer awe. And that's something that we also see with virtual reality. And by exploring the combination of the two methods at the same time, we might be able to induce a more profound psychedelic experience, especially among patients who are somehow resisting that experience or have a lot of experience and with the psychedelic state and might need a stronger method of induction than just the substance itself. Now, the second guiding principle that I mentioned is the empowerment. Again, it is a very tricky thing to expect that sense of empowerment and self-efficacy in patients who are visiting a hospital setting or a therapist office. because this is something that it does not belong to them, and they're just simply the guest in that space. With virtual reality, we can ensure that that space belongs to the patient. So it is actually the patient who's putting on the VR headset. They're the ones in control of that setting, and they're the ones who can build their own world for themselves to have that sense of empowerment and ownership over the setting that they're in. Obviously, in the therapist's office, they can't change the lights, they can't move around the plants, there's very little that they can do with that space. But by the sense of ownership of that space within VR, we can expect a stronger sense of empowerment in going into that healing journey. Virtual reality allows not only that sense of control of the stimuli within the VR space, but it can also buffer all the stimuli that is unwanted from our setting. And that's not just something that is negative, like the hospital setting. It can be very simple. It can be things like we see in the beautiful setup clinics that have a nice bed and beautiful paintings, but there's still the kind of elements that we know from our daily reality, which are tethering us to that daily reality. And that's something that we don't want as we go into the mystical experience. We actually want to be detached from that daily reality as much as possible. And so by using VR that is fully immersive, we can ensure that buffering sensation. And lastly is the sense of permanence. Again, in terms of the talk therapy processes that we have at the moment, we can't expect a therapist to be available to see the patient as often as the patient might need it. And we also can't expect the therapy to go on forever because it's a very resource-intensive process. But with virtual reality, we have access to technology that is permanent, that is allowing us to build something that can keep going for as long as we need that, and can be there for the patient to return to whenever they need this. So in doing so, in providing a model that can be ongoingly developed by the patient or by the patient and therapist together, we can ensure a more permanent type of framework that can be utilized for as long as needed. There's obviously a lot of limitations and side effects that need to be considered when we are thinking about introducing technology into psychedelic treatment. Some of the more obvious ones are the cyber sickness and physical discomfort. Obviously, especially if we consider dosing session and someone has just been through an experience that can be very embodied and quite difficult, using technology or using a VR headset might be quite uncomfortable. So we need to consider the entire experience design of the whole process and not just the virtual reality scenarios that we are providing the patients with. There's a big risk in terms of what kind of stimulus we're using. This can lead to overstimulation quite easily, or to distraction or overly leading of the contents of the psychedelic experience. So obviously it has to be deeply considered when we're using virtual reality, if we're using it, and it should be avoided using it, for example, right immediately before the dosing session, because that can inform a lot of the contents of the experience itself, which is something we'd like to avoid. So in looking at those three guiding principles that I mentioned, prioritizing the experiential moments in therapy, prioritizing empowerment of the patient, and ensuring the sense of permanence, we have developed a method within the VR virtual reality scenario that we call anchoring of the psychedelic experience. And the way it works is that patients visit a virtual reality model at the very end of their psychedelic session, when their experiences are still very vivid and profound, and they remember as much of them as possible. And they use the VR as a multisensory canvas. They basically express whatever they've been through during their psychedelic session and project that experience onto the VR space. Essentially, they're building a memory library of their psychedelic experience by creating either audio recordings, so leaving messages for themselves in form of audio recordings, or creating drawings or physical expressions of that experience. Sometimes it's a 2D drawing, sometimes it's a 3D model, depending on what the content of that experience was and what is the preferred method of self-expression. Then during the therapy sessions, the patient revisits those same models that they have built for themselves And they start the process of exploring those expressions either on their own or together with a therapist. So they can listen back to the messages that they left themselves, they can revisit their drawings, they can expand on those drawings. They then search for different underlying themes and connections between the insights that they've generated within VR. And they explore those themes visually by building either groups or links between insights. That's something that you can see on that second image there. And eventually, throughout the therapy process, they end up with the entire mind map of both their psychedelic experience and the therapeutic engagement. So it's a physical, tangible representation of their psychedelic session and the therapy that they've gone through with their therapist. Obviously, this is something that is preserved for them forever. They can keep coming back to that for as long as they need, and they can keep that model for themselves. And in that sense, that model belongs to them, not to the therapist. This is how sort of the end result of one of the scenarios looks like. So you can see sort of a number of insights that are represented by the little stars that have been generated by the user, and then a number of different groups and themes that have been identified that those insights belong to. And also, further in the therapy process, we're exploring different types of symbolic functions that represent the symbolism that has been experienced during the psychedelic session. So here you see one of the patients planting some of the relationships, sort of insights that came up during their session, and using water droplets to nourish those plants as they go through their therapy. And we've put that model into test during case studies in the Netherlands, together with the Psychedelic Society Belgium and Swinburne University in Melbourne. We've done this with 4 healthy participants, healthy volunteers who have used psilocybin-containing truffles and tested our anchoring VR model. This is how the timeline looked like. We had a very short preparation session, and then at the dosing point, this is when they drank the ginger lemon infused tea with psilocybin truffles. And at the very end of their dosing session, around 5 hours in, they used our anchoring model to, again, create those self-expressions of what their experience has been like. And then the next day, during the integration process, they revisited that same model and started that process of exploration, of being reminded of what that experience was like, both psychologically and emotionally, and then building on that experience to create that mind map. What we looked at was how acceptable, appropriate, and feasible that model was, and you've got the scores there, but perhaps the most important aspects of that are the accounts of the patients themselves, how that felt like. These are just some of those qualitative measures that we've used. I can read out a couple for you. VR helped me to reflect on the experience. It kept the marvel. You're not tripping anymore, but you're reminded by this magic vision. The stars filled with memories were helpful in structuring the mind. VR helped to come in touch with thoughts and feelings, and have also sorted out the difference between the thoughts and feelings in the experience. And how I thought about it afterwards, the stars changed. So here we are kind of seeing the 2 themes emerging. One, that the model itself reminds patients at a very psychological level of what the experience was like. And on the other hand, they are being reminded more emotionally of what it actually felt like. By being immersed in that same environment that they saw immediately after dosing, they're being sort of emotionally brought back into that same space of the experience. And that's something that we saw with our quantitative measures as well, looking at the level of introspection that has been induced with psilocybin itself, which is the dark red color, and then the level of introspection that was induced with our anchoring model. The gray here is a control VR, so it's a mystical type of VR that we use to see whether anchoring works better than the sort of commonly available VR scenarios. And what you see is that both in terms of the introspection, which is the state mindfulness scale, and in terms of the emotional reminder, which is that VR-induced affect checklist, there's a very close match between what psilocybin session induced induced and what the anchoring VR induced. And that's of importance for us because we can see that we can actually bring the patients back into that same feeling or sensation that they had during their psychedelic session. And what that means for us is that we have a much more reliable material to work with that we can then dive deeper into during the integration sessions. And big thanks to our advisory board. These are just some of them. I'm sure you know most of those people. And this is us. If you want any more information, just go to our website at enosistherapeutics.com. Thank you.
How does it compare with other integration techniques such as art therapy, yoga, bodywork, etc.?
Yeah, so the way we see VR is as one of the tools that are available to the therapist. And yes, we absolutely agree that those kind of methods should be used and should be explored more. And we're very happy to see that it is happening. And virtual reality is not meant to replace any of those other tools. It's not meant to replace mindfulness or body work. It's supposed to add on additional aspects that perhaps those methods cannot obtain on their own. And so that's why, as we mentioned, we are using it as a therapeutic tool, and it is there to support the work of the therapist. We're also not prescribing how it's supposed to be used. There are certain functions that we allow, but it's much more of an exploratory tool that can be used depending on how the patient and the therapist see it most fit. So it's just, yeah, it's one among many in the therapist toolbox that we just really want to see being expanded beyond those traditional approaches of talk therapy.
Okay, thank you. How accessible is this going to be? Or how do you plan on making it accessible for different minorities and other groups?
We have the first clinics globally already starting to use this product. So Mind Foundation, who are the leading research and advocacy organization in Berlin, were the first clinics in the world to be starting to use this. We've just come back from a tour around Europe and the US, where we've been offering this to multiple clinics. Broadly, commercial clinics will be paying to use this, but we are offering it to all research institutions for free. At the end of the day, our goal is to get this utilized as much as possible, and if research is being done with this, then we don't want to add any further burdens to research. But if there are commercial companies who are making a profit from their services, then we see no harm in them feeding into what will allow us to further develop this product.
Thank you. And finally, are there risks associated with the use of augmented and virtual reality technology in the long term, both individually and collectively?
Yeah, so at an individual level, I did mention some of those side effects that have to be considered very carefully. Again, it is a tool, and how we use it is up to us. We are responsible for generating the kind of content that the patients will be using, and so the scenarios that we're developing have to be developed through a research-heavy approach. And one of the sort of the worries that we have is that there is a lot of commercial players in this field, and that a lot of those scenarios that are being made available might be skewed a little bit by sort of their agendas. And so what we would like to see is for there to be a lot of research into what kind of scenarios are more supportive for the patient experiences, how can we make them personally adjustable and more individually sort of targeted so that they're beneficial and they don't bring any harm to the users. There's absolutely a lot of harm that can be done, especially, for example, we consider using elements that might lead to accidental exposure. So something that might be triggering for a user that, even though it might look very mild to us, like some sort of water body in the VR scenario, it can be read by someone as danger. And exposing them to those triggers is absolutely, obviously absolutely unfair to be providing those kind of scenarios, but it can be a huge danger to the patients themselves.
All right, thank you very much. I think in the interest of time, we'll close it off there, but thank you very much, Prash and Agnieszka, for